I'd like to introduce now Steph Hughes, who has travelled a long way to be with us today and who has been researching for a while and at some considerable expense statistics, prison statistics, and she's endeavouring to get data not only from this state but from other states in Australia as well. The title of Steph's presentation is Women's Safety and Sex Self-ID. What does Queensland crime data tell us? As the founder of the Facebook page Fair Go for Queensland Women, Steph Hughes was awarded the inaugural Eva Bacon Award by IWD Brisbane Meanjin in 2019. She continues to develop and maintain that Facebook page today. Steph has undertaken graduate study in family and domestic violence and has an ongoing interest in research in this area. She also researches male pattern violence more broadly and has a particular interest in the damaging effects on women in prison who are forced to be housed with men who identify as women. Steph has a very busy life as a full-time worker and a single parent to 2 children. And as Steph comes to the podium, I'll just remind you of something Evelyn asked me to let you know. If you haven't paid for today, feel welcome to pay using your credit card with Evelyn at the merch table. Thank you, Steph.
Thank you for your time and being here today. I too would like to acknowledge and extend acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today, I'd like to avail you of information related to Queensland crime data, which, when controlled for gender identity, I believe confirms male pattern violence and criminality. In addition to that, I will also discuss how sex self-ID policies have created negative environments for incarcerated women and propose that there must be delineation between sex and gender identity. I propose to discuss how self-ID policies have created negative environments for incarcerated women and propose that there must be delineation between sex and gender identity in policy and law in order to safeguard some of the most vulnerable people in our community, incarcerated women. Firstly, a word on language. Queensland Human Rights Commission, which I will probably call QHRC here on in, defines transgender as meaning a person that does not identify with the biological sex they were assigned at birth. Similarly, as in the slide there, gender identity is referred to in the Anti-Discrimination Act as a person who A, identifies or has identified as a member of the opposite sex and seeks to live as a member of that sex, or B, is of indeterminate sex and seeks to live as a member of a particular sex. QHRC points out that this definition is based on self-ID rather than legal paperwork. QHRC also notes that sex and gender are different, and that is something that I would agree upon. I hope to demonstrate today that a person's sex and their gender identity, if they have one, can be utilised to make policy and legislation, and should be, and we should not discard sex, as sex is and will remain an important and immutable factor in our lives. The Swedish long-term study by Dehaena and others, released in 2011, examines outcomes for individuals who have had surgical related intervention related to their gender. This study found that male study participants had a similar risk of criminal convictions as male controls. While some people have sought to pick apart the study to suggest this is not the outcome, that is clearly identified in the text of the document, and I've highlighted the relevant section there. It should be noted that these individuals are not representative of the self-ID cohort, and if we are to be honest, then we must recognise that individuals who self-ID rather than undertake surgical intervention related to gender, present different risks to those who self-ID. So some people suggest, including criminologists, that it is not unreasonable to conflate sex and gender identity, and I do not know that that is a reasonable way to go about things. In some respects, it feels very much like Groundhog Day, where many will seek any means to avoid talking about male pattern violence. It is disheartening to see even criminologists claim that there should be no barrier to males self-identifying into female spaces, including the female prison estate, because women are violent too. And I have read that in a peer-reviewed article. Or that the majority of sexual assaults in prison are perpetrated by correctional staff. So presumably introducing male inmates to the women's prison won't matter. I sought specific data from Queensland Corrective Services to examine what is occurring to help form a basis for discussion, as it did not appear that others, such as journalists, were actually curious about this situation. And I wanted to find out what data there was so that this could inform the discussion in Queensland. The first thing I was able to identify from those rights to information requests was that in the data gathered from 2013 to 2019, male pattern criminality far exceeds that of females in the Queensland prison estate. So the data there relates to the number of people accommodated in Queensland Correctional Services facilities on the 30th of June each year. So that's just a snapshot, essentially, of what occurs in each year. So as you can see, the difference between male and female incarceration rates varies significantly based upon sex. Disaggregating data further to take self-identified gender identity into account, that same pattern remains evident. That is to say, of those individuals incarcerated in Queensland, I might just say QCS, accommodations, the number of males who self-identified as transgender exceeded the number of females who self-identified similarly. Although this is a small group, the disparity is far greater than in the general population. The number of males who self-identify as transgender incarcerated in Queensland prison estates ranged from as low as 16 in 2014 to 31 in 2017. It must be noted though that as far as I've been able to clarify so far, these figures do not include individuals who had surgical intervention related to gender and that have had their birth certificates subsequently altered in line with current births, deaths and marriages legislation. At this time, it appears there's no tracking of those individuals possible. However, I am seeking clarification on that issue. Why do small numbers of individuals self-identifying as transgender in the prison estate matter? It matters because while the actual numbers suggest the rate of male offending appears to persist despite gender identity, there is also the matter of male pattern criminality. That is, the types of crimes that are committed. As I think Janet eloquently pointed out, women and men, males and females, perform or are offending in different ways for different reasons. Finally, there is also considerations regarding the impact even one male individual in the women's prison estate could have on multiple people, multiple female inmates. To discuss this, we will look at two specific crimes: murder and aggravated sexual assault. Firstly, you will note that in each year, there were 3 males who self-identified as transgender being held either as convicted or charged for the offence of murder. If self-ID were to be in place during the years 2013 to 17, that would increase the number of recorded female murderers by 10 or more %. If self-ID were in place, that could mean that the government could be threatened with legal action lest they transfer those males to the female prison estate. As we do not know who these individuals are, it's difficult to assess how great the specific risk they may present to the female inmates may be. What we do know though is that even from small numbers, is that the criminal profile of males who self-identify as transgender is not similar to that of females in the Queensland prison estate. As noted by Helen Joyce in the book Trans, allowing males to self-identify into women's prisons makes women less safe. As for the danger to trans women from using male spaces, raising this is a backhanded acknowledgement of the purpose of the female spaces. In terms of sexual crime, those charged or convicted of aggravated sexual assault during the relevant years are presented for both sex and disaggregated to show self-identified transgender individuals here. Again, it is evident that female offending is far less than male offending. When looking at males who say they are transgender, it is clear that even for such a small population in Queensland, these individuals are overrepresented in relation to women. For the benefit of those who need for it to be repeated, this does not mean that all males who identify as transgender are sexual offenders, as some people needed to be reminded recently. What this means is that sexual violence appears to remain a significant concern regardless of gender identity when we are talking about male individuals. To examine this in terms of percentages, in 2017, 25% of the total population of males who identified as transgender were either charged or convicted and accommodated in QCS facilities in relation to aggravated sexual assault. So in relation to these charges, this is the most serious offence that is being discussed. This is in contrast to about 10% in the male general population, and 1.29% in the female population. That's the number of total individuals on the 30th of June each year. So 1.29% of the female 698 women, 1.29% were incarcerated, either charged or convicted of an aggravated sexual assault as their most serious charge. I would submit that unless and until there is evidence to suggest otherwise, we must prioritise the safety and well-being of incarcerated women over the rights of those who seek to live as women in the context of single-sex spaces such as prisons. This is important because of what we know about male pattern offending and criminality, but also because our First Nations women continue to be overrepresented in our prison populations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and all incarcerated women are recognised as being very likely to have significant trauma histories related to male violence. If we are to provide trauma-informed care and support to these women, one of the primary means of achieving this is via the provision of single-sex spaces. So we are aware that there is a policy in place that allows individuals to apply to be transferred. That does not, because we do not have legislation, I suppose, there's facility to apply. We know that one individual male has applied but was not successful in being transferred to the female estate. A corrective services article from March 2019 describes the specific challenges experienced by incarcerated women, much of which is due to our sex. I've screenshot the short article here because it's only a few hundred words. But women who are in prison can come from lives characterised by poverty, sexual, emotional and physical abuse, domestic violence, substance addiction and lack of education. The path to prison is very different from male prisoners, and it is nice to see that they recognise that female prisoners have very different needs to male prisoners. So in 2019, QCS said that 87% of women in custody have been victims of child sexual abuse, physical violence or domestic violence. 66% have been victim survivors of all those types of abuse. Queensland Human Rights Commission conducted consultation regarding women in prison in Queensland in 2019. using the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders called the Bangkok Rules, and the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for treatment of prisoners, which is called the Nelson Mandela Rules. This formed the basis of the consultation, in addition to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is unfortunate that while conducting that consultation with women in prison in 2019, and in the subsequent report, Queensland Human Rights Commission failed to mention that Rule 11 of the Mandela Rules has specific guidance regarding the separate categories for men and women, in addition to other separate categories like youth and adult, and similar separations. As transgender and gender identity are not mentioned in the Mandela Rules or the Bangkok Rules, it appears that we can and should take, when they say men and women or male and female, to mean the normal understanding of those words. Despite this discrepancy, the QHRC report notes the consultation focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, women with disabilities, including mental illnesses, women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and trans women. Presumably, the QHRC believed that transgender women can and should be included in the report because of the Yogyakarta rules, which appear to be of lesser standing to the Mandela and Bangkok rules and are not mentioned earlier in the report when the basis of the consultation was discussed. I submit that there is not sufficient evidence to promote the notion that those who identify as transgender should be treated as the opposite sex for all purposes. I submit that the evidence we have suggests that there are definite areas where there should be separation. So you'll notice that Rule 11, different categories of prisoners shall be kept in separate institutions or parts of institutions. Men and women shall, so far as possible, be detained in separate institutions. So this takes into account age, sex, criminal record, and legal reason for their detention. So it is unclear to me, and however I must say I'm not a legal professional, it's unclear to me why QHRC has included males who identify as transgender in their women in prisons. Multiple examples exist to show that when female spaces, such as women's prisons, have included males, women have been harmed. As many women have predicted, it has eventuated that incarcerated women have been negatively impacted by males being transferred to the women's estate. This was recognised during a recent UK judicial review, with the discussion in that decision raising the issue of risk and safety assessments. Despite these kinds of policies being in place and presumably being lawful, I would submit that there is evidence that these assessments are not sufficient. For example, we know that only a tiny fraction of sexual offences are ever reported to police, let alone result in a charge and much less a conviction. To assume that a male who has no criminal charges or convictions for sexual offences is therefore not a risk for sexual violence in spaces where they have access to females in vulnerable states is largely ignoring, I would submit, the reality of sexual violence perpetration, both here and elsewhere. Some negative impacts are listed there: pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, sexual violence, threats, and actual physical violence. To be very, very clear, this is not because individuals say they are transgender. This is because of the male sex. And that is why I submit wholeheartedly that there must be ways to keep both factors in mind. On Friday, a feminist reporting organisation, Redux, released a story about the experiences of an incarcerated woman, I think it's Maseka Diggs, who is housed in the Women's Correctional Centre in New Jersey. Diggs reiterates what we know about incarcerated women. The majority are victim survivors of male violence and are described by Diggs as being scared to death of the male transfers to the female prison estate. The story outlines one negative experience Diggs has relayed to the Redux team regarding being forced to shower with a 6'7" male who identifies as transgender and had been convicted of murder. She relayed about observations regarding the person's leering type behaviour in the showers. We've shared this article to our Facebook page if you wanted to locate it later. I would submit that there are clear and predictable outcomes arising from ignoring sex in relation to our safeguarding for women and prioritising gender identity. There must be balance and there must be honest discussion regarding these issues, lest the interests of all parties are unmet. Certainly, I do not foresee good relations arising from moves to remove sex-based safeguarding or single-sex spaces. We have already seen and continue to see disrespect for women regarding raising issues of concern regarding this matter, and episodes of male violence directed at women who seek to discuss these issues. The practice of removing single-sex spaces has proven to be harmful to women, and that should concern us all, not least because those most often most harmed are among those of us who already face multiple oppressions. To move forward, it is essential that open discussions based on clear definitions, evidence, material reality, and respect for different viewpoints occurs.